he had the authority to say no. And let me remind you of that quote in Dr. Subbarao's book, where he talked about the relationship between Dr. Reddy and Mr. Chidambaram based on a phone call, where Dr. Reddy's side he was hearing, and Dr. Reddy said no, 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 and yes, eventually. And when Dr. Subbarao asked, what were you saying no to? He said, he asked me to relax this and relax that, and I kept saying no. Ultimately, he asked, can you hear me? And I said, yes. And that's how the call ended. But that, I think, anecdote.
And the other is a hard-nosed politician, and I'm not referring to individuals here. I'm referring to the two men who head it. The RBI governor is supposed to be a technocrat with this team. The finance minister of New Delhi are hard-nosed politicians with very different objectives. And you're right, your table must have been laden with letters from New Delhi. But in some sense, are these two men or women, hopefully in the future, from Mars and Venus, where the two are going to disagree because they've got two different objectives, and it's going to be elusive for us to try and bring them together?
No, I think it is possible to disagree but still be respectful of each other's territory. And I think certainly in my relationships, there were many disagreements. But I hope there was an understanding that this was not because of bloody-mindedness, but because there was a worry. And they knew when the RBI said yes, it meant we were taking responsibility for the financial stability consequences. And we always tried to maximize the potential for growth while keeping that financial stability concern. And this is what sometimes in the commentary out there in the press, I think people don't understand. Of course, the RBI is essentially, in some ways an agency of the government. And of course, it has to respect the overall sort of concerns and objectives of the government. But the government has entrusted it with the responsibility for financial stability, and therefore it has to, as a good responsible entity, carry out that responsibility. And sometimes, as I said, the seatbelt constraints. But that seatbelt constraints because you put it on, and you put it on knowing that it will prevent you from an accident.
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy to make, and I wonder if Veeracharya should have had a chat with you and used that analogy instead of the wrath of markets, really. But Dr. Rajan, while your table was laden with letters from the government, we are now hearing Section 9 being invoked. Under what circumstances do you believe invoking Section 9 is justified? Or is it a nuke that must never be used?
So I think you mean Section 7, as I understand. But
sorry,
look,
Section 7. My apologies there. Section 7.
When it let me put it this way. First, Section 7 hasn't been invoked, so that's the good news. And I do believe that when the relation gets so precarious that it has to be invoked, we have to be very worried. That said, I think the dialogue between the Reserve Bank and the government is always an ongoing one. There are always sort of points of view being expressed. Sometimes there are sort of disagreements. But ultimately, it works based on respect. You have to know why the other guy is doing what he's doing. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to part, maybe not as friends, but as respectful of each other's territory. It's when you encroach on each other's territory that it becomes problematic. And I would hope that that respect gets reestablished.
I kind of agree with you there, but I want to talk about a substantive issue of disagreement, and one of them is liquidity infusion in the markets right now. The government is very insistent that this must be done to bail out the NBFCs that are facing a cash crunch. The RBI believes there's enough liquidity in the system, and that is really a judgment call for the central bank to make. But is this really, a cry for more funds, or is this more funds required to avert a bailout, avert a superstition by the government of many more NBFCs like ILFS?
So, look, I think that I don't want to get into the specifics of the case because there's more information than I have on the specific frailties of NBFCs. But generally, in a situation where there is financial stress, the central bank has to figure out whether it's ultimately a liquidity problem, that is, infusing liquidity into the market will resolve some of those issues, or is it a solvency problem? That is, some of these entities have taken on really bad assets and really they are decapitalized. So the reality is, if it's a solvency problem, that doesn't mean that the government and Reserve Bank shouldn't intervene. But it really involves the fiscal use of funds, and therefore the government has to be directing that and putting taxpayer money at risk. Now that's a big political issue because you're using taxpayer money to bail out a private entity, and people will ask, these people who made money over so many years, why is it that you're bailing them out? That was obviously a big issue in the United States when the bailouts took place. If it is primarily solvency, you can address that by infusing liquidity into the market through more OMOs. And if the problem is you need liquidity directed to certain places, perhaps lend to certain entities who can make those loans. I think the recent move to allow sort of banks to guarantee bonds by these entities is a good one. That said, I think any kind of intervention should come after the entities that are in difficulty have taken their own steps to bolster their balance sheets. If your view is your commercial paper is coming 6 months from now and therefore you're worried about rollover, shouldn't you be raising equity now, even if prices are depressed, in order to back your balance sheet? That would be a good signal that in fact it's not directly running to the government and the central bank to bail yourself out, that you're willing to take all the steps, and it's only when all the markets are frozen that you go, at which point the government has to decide, is it a liquidity or a solvency? If it's a solvency, it may require wiping out the equity of these entities and taking them over, as for example, I think ILFS has been done.